Greetings, everyone. And since Shabbat is technically over, Shavua Tov. Trust you had a good Shabbat. And since this is the first time we're meeting in this year, happy second New Year. Having had a happy New Year earlier on during the high holiday season, we get a second one. And so we launched this year with some of the questions you sent in to us, and any questions that those of you who are actually with us virtually in real time have, or who are here with us, we'll take those questions as well. That having been said, let's get started by talking to God. Thank you, Father, for this opportunity, and as we've just reflected on another year to start anew, so to speak. And from a Jewish perspective, it gives us sort of a second start to a new year, and for this we're grateful as well. We're grateful for the way in which you renew us, the way in which you give us new opportunities, the way in which you have in the past worked in our lives and in the lives of those with whom we are familiar, whether it's friends or family or people who are part of history, whether that history is biblical or history outside the Bible. We're grateful to the God who works with us and works with his people. And so we'd ask that during the course of our time together, you would work in a special way through our interactions with one another, and that there would be clarity, good communication, and understanding. In Yeshua's name, amen.
Hi, I did hear you tapping at the window, but since I'm on camera, I decided not to run over. Anyway, hi, nice to see you.
And we, in a sense, just got an answer to prayer because we pray, and who shows up? Jackie's among us.
Yeah.
So, all right, now, our usual procedure is we allow those who are actually present in the room to ask any questions before we get started with the questions that have been sent in to us. So we do try to give priority to those who make the effort to be here with us, to make us feel better by having some human faces to see in real space and time in front of us rather than just on the monitor.
Oh, they can fall asleep.
Yeah, or they can fall asleep and the camera's on us. Okay, so Jessica, your question that you had emailed to us is in the pile. So other than that, do any of you have any questions that come to mind at this point? All right, then, which of those questions do you think we should start with?
I don't know. I just grabbed this one because I want to look up the citation. So, that wasn't the one you had on top, was it?
Yes, this was.
Okay, so go ahead. That's fine.
Okay. All right, then we'll start with this. And this is a somewhat multi-layered question. It says, what kind of insight can rabbinic literature shed on Yeshua's halakhic decision with regards to the adulterous episode in the Gospels? Please cite the rabbinic sources used. On that note, what can rabbinic literature also tell us in regards to divorce in the Gospels, when it is said that if you divorce and marry another, it is adultery? Does this mean a divorcee can never marry another person? Or is it to prevent divorcing one person in order to specifically marry another? Like in the instance of divorcing one's wife in order to get a younger and more beautiful wife. Or we could flip that around, divorcing a husband to do the same. But is it really against frivolous divorce as well? How do the views of Hillel and Shammai on divorce factor into this? Okay. As I said, multi-layered, and there's all kinds of discussion on this. I think the discussion used to be a whole lot heavier and more volatile in years gone by than it is more recently.
I think, and there is still a brand of fundamentalist Christians who say that divorce is never allowed.
Yeah.
That's because they don't read the verses other than that one verse.
Yeah.
There's other verses that say that divorce is allowable.
Yeah, and the reason I prefaced it the way I did, in years gone by, it was almost as if that divorce was the unforgivable sin in many what we would call fundamentalistic or conservative or evangelical congregations. I mean,
More than murder.
yeah, that's where I was going to go. Interestingly enough, on a functional basis, even more than murder in many congregations. So if you were divorced, that's it. As far as any possibility of any kind of leadership or major contribution in certain congregations and congregational life. Without giving any details other than just a very general observation, I'm thinking in the last 2 years, I'm reasonably sure that this has occurred post-COVID. I heard of a person who, in effect, was moved from leadership because, now let me try to get it straight. I believe he divorced and then he got remarried according to the rest of the leaders in the congregation too soon. And so, in a sense, he was removed from leadership or pressured out of leadership. So this is not something that is just a situation in past history, but it's a situation that is even ongoing in our day and age. There's a whole lot of debate concerning divorce, and there's a whole lot of misunderstanding concerning divorce. But I will remind you of what is at the basis of the question or questions that were asked here, and that is, there is a biblical provision for divorce. Now, it does occur in the Old Testament, and unfortunately that means some who have, as we understand it, a skewed misunderstanding of the relationship between the Older and Newer Testaments. There are some people in certain circles that think that the newer has supplanted the older, and therefore the older is no longer
Useful.
I wasn't going to say useful, but useful. But that's
Doesn't
appropriate.
apply.
Is not intended to govern us, is where I was going to go. But useful is
Somebody else's mail.
it's somebody else. Yeah, there are a lot of people who view it that way. Now, in one sense, it is somebody else's mail. It's Jewish mail, but that doesn't mean it doesn't apply to modern people who are followers of Yeshua, whether they are Jews or non-Jews, or whatever their particular stripe is. Then Yeshua's statements are viewed in such a way as to be presented so that they have set aside what was there, and I believe it's Deuteronomy 24. They set aside what was there written concerning divorce, superseded by Yeshua's statements, which are then assumed to be that there is no divorce acceptable. Let's remind ourselves right at the outset that Yeshua is the one who said, "I've not come to set aside, to abolish, to annul, to make invalid, to repeal." Any of those words work for the Greek that's used there in Matthew 5. I've not come to do any of those things regarding the Torah and the prophets, and the writings are included as part of that catch-all category. I've come to fulfill them, and please remember, and we've referenced this on a number of occasions in our Stump to Stars sessions. Fulfill means exactly what it sounds like in English. It means to fill full, not to set aside. Now, that works real well. The Greek works real well in translating. In English, it doesn't work as well to have that nice ready-made definition in other languages. And by that I mean fulfill means fill full. So, not set aside. So, we've got to take seriously the texts that preceded what Yeshua's discussion was. Now, having set the stage that way, I'm going to take the second part, because the episode concerning the adulteress is something very interesting, intriguing, and at one level, not directly related to the second question. All right. If you divorce and marry another, is it adultery? That's the first part of the question. What does rabbinic literature say about that? Now, in this particular case, as you might suspect, if you know anything about the rabbinic literature, you will get more than one opinion. And the two major opinions at the time of Yeshua were the opinions of Hillel and his followers and Shammai and his followers, or the school of Hillel and the school of Shammai. There's an appropriate note in the NIV Study Bible that cites the same thing. So since it's there and succinct, I thought I would share what it has to say. I'm reading from the Matthew 19 text. Let me just, for the fun of it, see what the difference is with Mark. Because Mark leaves out a phrase that's in Matthew. And I think because Mark leaves it out, because of the way Mark has it structured and leaves out this particular phrase, I think that's the text that has engendered, so to speak, the discussion that, according to Yeshua, divorce is an absolute no-no. The introduction to the discussion in Matthew chapter 19 reads like this. Some among the Pharisees came to question him. They asked, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason? That phrase is not found in the Mark version of the text.
Which phrase?
For any and every reason. And it's on this that the NIV Study Bible appropriately picks up. Mark is just trying to focus on a different aspect of what Yeshua is trying to present than is Matthew. The two do not contradict one another. They should be read side by side. But here's the observation. Matthew possibly included it because he's writing to the Jews who were aware of the dispute between the schools of Shammai and Hillel over the interpretation of Deuteronomy 14:1-4. Now that note is good as far as it goes, but what it implies is that Mark wasn't written to the Jews, but was written to others. So let me quickly address that. I will address that a little more fully and this is a commercial, so fasten your seatbelts, in the course that I'll be teaching on Thursday nights called Jewish Roots and Foundations of Scripture, Part 2. You don't have to have been in Part 1 to be involved in Part 2. I will be addressing the issue of to whom the Gospel writers were writing. And let me say right at the outset, Mark also was written to Jews, period. Not that others couldn't read it, but it was written to Jews. And I'll provide all kinds of reasons for why I say that, but that's part of the course. But the rest of the observation is correct. Matthew is writing to Jews who are certainly familiar with the discussion between Hillel and Shammai. Shammai held that there's a phrase, something indecent, in Deuteronomy 24, verses 1-4, that something indecent meant marital unfaithfulness, the only allowable cause for divorce. Hillel emphasized the preceding clause, who divorces his wife if she has done anything he disliked, even if she burned his food without cooking it. Jesus clearly took the side of Shammai, but only after first pointing back to God's original ideal for marriage in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, which are quoted in this particular text. So, Hillel had a much broader, how should I put it, field of reasons for divorce being acceptable. And in fact, it seemed to be very, compared to Shammai, it was very, very loose. Yeshua comes down on the side of Shammai in this particular instance, that it is only for adultery, marital unfaithfulness, and anything that is in keeping with that. He is dealing with the text that Moses left behind for the people. Now, I will say this: this is virtually the only time that Yeshua comes out on the side of the school of Shammai in the discussions between Hillel and Shammai. Yeshua's approach to Jewish tradition was very much along the flexible and, I think I'll just leave it that way, the more flexible lines and understanding and interpretation of Hillel. In fact, in his book, Jesus the Pharisee, Rabbi Harvey Folk makes a very good argument that Yeshua was in fact a Hillelite. He was a follower of Hillel, and he goes through some of his teachings and how they line up with the arguments of Hillel in virtually all cases except this particular one. So Hillel had a broader understanding of what could qualify for divorce. Shammai had a very restricted understanding. So that's what's being interacted with here. And so he says, I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for marital unfaithfulness and marries another commits adultery. Now, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to recall something from 1 Corinthians that relates to this, but it's not coming to mind readily, so we won't take it, won't go down that aside. It's somewhere in, if I recall correctly, chapters 6 to 10. But what is marital unfaithfulness? Now, we have our own definition of marital unfaithfulness, and perhaps sometimes it is a little too restricted for what is in mind here. For example, would marital unfaithfulness include spousal abuse? Or is it just described by extramarital relations, or however you want to phrase that? Many of those who've studied this text, and in fact the related Corinthians texts, as well as the text from Deuteronomy, will argue, and I think correctly, that yes, spousal abuse is technically marital unfaithfulness, because it's not being faithful to the marriage vows and what the husband and the wife committed to each other as to how they would treat one another. Now, I understand fully that there are many who might disagree with me, but since the question was raised to us, that is the way in which I would answer in this particular question. Now, so the questioner asked, is it really against frivolous divorce? And yes, basically that is a good way of describing it. Yeshua is responding to those who too easily were involved in frivolous divorce. Divorce is a serious thing. By the way, I would also suggest that the biblical texts do not qualify a divorced person from holding leadership in a congregation, or we'll just leave it at that, in a congregation. And again, there are some people who teach that yes, divorce is the ultimate disqualifier.
Well, because they take that phrase, husband of one wife, and they make it do a lot of heavy lifting.
Yeah, now since you brought that up,
Yes, dear.
then I guess we'll have to deal with that phrase, husband of one wife.
Go ahead. You're Mr. New Testament guy.
Or to to broaden it somewhat, the phrase could also apply to wife of one husband. Mm-hmm. Now, if you think about that in the larger context, the straightforward rendering of that would be that you are married to only one person
At a time.
at a time. You see, in the Second Temple period, in the Roman Empire, there were people who were married to more than one spouse. By the way, going back in the biblical time, there were people who were married to more than one spouse.
I found the thing in 1 Corinthians 7.
Okay.
1 Corinthians 7, verse 10.
Hold it.
Okay, I was just...
Let me, coming to that second. I was going to give some examples. Abraham. Often considered the father of the Jewish people, and rightly so, and Sarah is the mother. Abraham had, in effect, another wife. Her name was Hagar. Now, horrors. That was not horrible in his day and age. That practice was perfectly acceptable. And apparently it was acceptable as far as God was concerned as well, because God never chose him out for doing this. Oh, and by the way, Sarah is the one who suggested the second wife.
I thought she was a concubine.
Well, she was, but she did start out as such, but in effect functioned as.
In my mind,
Go
a
ahead.
concubine is a woman who is not married to the man, and yet they have a legal contractual relationship where the man agrees that children she has belong to him, and he will take care of them, just as with the children from his wife. But they are not bound by the marriage vows. But it is a contract.
Yes, it is a contract.
It's not just, I'm going to sleep around and have some babies.
Yeah.
It's not like that.
Yeah, and it's in that larger, broader sense that I mentioned Hagar. Now, when we get to Jacob, Jacob clearly has two wives, plus, since we're going to use that term, concubines, plus a couple concubines as well. And that was perfectly acceptable in that day and age. Jacob never gets chewed out for having two wives. Now, it caused some family friction, but that kind of family friction can occur in all kinds of family relationships.
We had a good friend. She's no longer with us, but she's still our good friend. And she used to say, the situations that people get themselves into in the 21st century, where I married you and you married him, and then now we have all these kids from various husbands and wives, and we're raising them all together. That's just what you see in the life of Jacob. You're not my mother. You're not my father. You can't tell me what to do. I'm going to go live over here and have her be my mother, and I'm not going to let you be my father. It's those kinds of, we have it today. It's nothing that unique.
And Jewish tradition does, in fact, reinforce and understand correctly that both wives of Jacob were on equal footing. Because in many of the blessings that we utilize in our traditions, may you be like Rachel and Leah, or Leah and Rachel, as you say a blessing over your wife or over your daughter.
He owes them exactly the same thing.
Exactly. So, it was only later in Judaism that the instruction came about, or the regulation came about, that you could only be married, you could not have multiple spouses. So husband of one wife is a reference to what husband of one wife means that for a person to be in leadership within a congregation at that time, as the rabbi said, Rav Shaul in this case, it would be important for you to have only one spouse. Why one spouse? Because if you had more than one, you didn't have enough time to devote yourself to leadership functions and responsibilities, because you had too many family responsibilities.
Or you should have.
Or you should be taking.
You can't just blow them off because you have busy
no.
work you have to go over there.
Yeah, exactly. There was something else that popped in my mind, but it popped right back out. So
I was going to mention something from more modern day history. So and I learned this in History of Missions.
Mhm.
So when the beginning generation of Christians who went to Africa in order, to convert the heathen in Africa, one of the problems they ran into was they had a lot of response. They had groups that met together with them. But here's the issue that they came upon. They had a large percentage of Muslims already in the African subcontinent. And so what happened was, if you wanted to have, if you were the minister or the pastor and you wanted to have some lay leadership, like what we would call elders or Baptists call deacons, there was almost no man that didn't have at least 2 wives, because that was the norm in those cultures, the Muslim cultures. And there was something about some of you were allowed up to 4 wives. So it's not like the Mormons. The Muslims were allowed 4 wives. But when you put your finger on the text of husband of 1 wife, then, and you're only seeing it in terms of they can only have one wife, and so therefore they're ineligible to be in leadership in the congregation. And that became a problem, because then we don't have any lay leaders. And then does the minister or the pastor preach that they are sinning by having these wives? And then if you divorce everyone and keep one of them, then what are you going to do with all these women who have been thrust out of their houses because of reading the Bible and putting your finger on every single word and not seeing the context? So this is not something that's hypothetical. To us in modern day America, it might seem silly, but it was not. It was a problem in the whole continent. I'm not sure how and when they resolve this problem. My History of Missions did not give me what has happened in where are we now in the 21st century. But depending on the culture that you're bringing the word of the Lord into, it can be a big fat problem, because part of marriage, and we all know this, is the Social Security aspect of marriage. In other words, you have a household and there's enough money to keep you going together. But once you step out of that relationship, maybe there's not going to be any money at all coming in. And those are, I think, weighty matters of the law. Possibly just as weighty as divorce. I'm done.
You were going to bring in the 1 Corinthians 7.
Okay. It says, I am in chapter 7, 1 Corinthians, verse 10. To the married I give this command. And then Rav Shaul says, not I, but the Lord. So he's calling in the heavy hitters. A wife must not separate from her husband, but if she does, she must remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband, and a husband must not divorce his wife. I think that's where they're getting this. God does not tolerate divorce.
But that's not what the text says. The text allows for divorce, and it seems to set aside the possibility of remarriage. It goes on to say, in verse 12, to the rest I say this, I, not the Lord, if a brother has a wife who is not a believer and she is willing to live with him, he must not divorce her. And if a woman has a husband who is not a believer and he is willing to live with her, she must not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband has been sanctified through his wife, and the unbelieving wife has been sanctified through her husband.
Otherwise, your children would be unclean. But as it is, they are holy.
But if the unbeliever leaves, let them do so. A believing man or woman is not bound in such circumstances.
What?
God has called us to live in peace. God has called us to live in peace, by the way, is a rabbinic concept called shalom bayit. Peace in the family is a very important thing. And when that term is used, it's used primarily within the family itself, but it's also expanded to be a regulating concept in the community as well. So peace in the house applies not just in the family home, but in the community setting as well.
Yeah, let's repeat that, because I think that's worth repeating. A believing man or woman is not bound in such circumstances. What circumstances are they not bound in? If the unbeliever leaves, particularly because you're a believer and they're not.
So now we see yet another particular situation that is cited where divorce is acceptable. Now, how we bring all these things together into a more coherent understanding regarding divorce and, in fact, remarriage is built on the extension of these various texts that we've looked at and some further texts as well. But I think, by and large, we have dealt with that part of the question. Sufficiently so, Jessica? Okay. There are whole books that have been written on divorce and remarriage and dealing with the various texts. And if books have been written on it, we certainly are not going to cover the whole of the subject at this particular point.
This is a good time to tell everybody, if you have not familiarized yourself with a website called Sefaria, 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 which is based on the word sefer, which in Hebrew means book. And you go there, you can type in a phrase or, let's say, divorce, and it will automatically sort not just the scriptures, but a long, heavy range of rabbinic thought on that, and give you page after page after page, and you can just read it all day if you would like. But it really gives you complete, as complete as we can have here in Florida, since we don't have Yeshiva University Library. It will give you a very, very good start in the various scriptures and their interpretations, but also then various Talmudic passages on that topic. Yes?
Yeah, exactly. Another thought did strike me. As you're dealing with the 1 Corinthians 7 text, you need to look at it at the whole of the chapter, not just this particular section. If you're going to come down hard on this one section, then you've got to remember to come down hard on the earlier section. And the earlier section says this: here is what I would suggest to you. This is what I would prefer, given our day and age. He says it's good for a person to remain unmarried. So before you hit the second part too heavily, please remember the first part too. And so you need to look at the whole flow of the chapter to see where it's going and why it's going, before you just excerpt one part of it and make it your one rule to live by. It's one of several.
Yeah, I was just going to mention that several scholars have posited that Rav Shaul was married.
Yeah.
And she died, and he never remarried. And that's why he goes into, I wish you were all like me, because he'd learned to live in his widowhood and didn't feel a real need to go, hounding after women when he's on his preaching route.
Okay. I know that brings in all kinds of other layers of questions and ambiguities, but guess what? That's where the text leads us, and leaves us to then continue the discussion as to how we apply all these things in our lives and in our circumstances. By the way, given that he was a Pharisee, there is every likelihood that Rav Shaul was married at one time. When he's writing 1 Corinthians 7, he is at that point not married. Okay, just trying to see if there's anything further in this text.
There's a lot about marriage in the middle of 1 Corinthians.
Yeah.
Starting with chapter 7 and going into 11. He goes in and out, but the theme of the whole section of 1 Corinthians is what's the situation of the divorcee? What's the situation of unmarried people? What's the situation of married people? And don't forget, this is the Corinthian church. The Corinthian church, outside of it being in Greece, there were very good Jews in Greece during that time. But please remember that according to the Rav Shaul's letters to them, and he wrote 2 long letters to them, they are a mess in Corinth. That congregation is a mess. And they are doing things that are outright against, especially the Torah, first 5 books of Moses. Because evidently, I'm just going to say this with a wink, they don't know enough about the Torah. Somehow these might have been, a lot of Gentiles have jumped into their Messianic movement and have not learned the proper way of doing things. They have not been mentored in a synagogue first before then going into what people might commonly call a church. And so it's important to see that background. So I would wait a long time before I grabbed some verses out of 1st or 2nd Corinthians and said, see, I'm going to do this because this is great and this is what Rav Shaul said. Rav Shaul was talking to a very troubled congregation who couldn't keep the faith because they hadn't learned about their faith. Are you with us?
Yep.
He's reading 1 Corinthians.
Yeah, because I was reading further on into the chapter where again he repeats, now about virgins I have no command from the Lord, but I give a judgment as whom by the Lord's mercy is trustworthy. It is good for you to remain as you are. And this is now the 2nd time he's brought it up. He's brought it up at the beginning of the chapter. He's bringing it up yet again as the chapter comes to a conclusion.
Is that sort of like the King Jamesian, sufficient unto the day is the evil thereto, which
Yeah, that sort of works.
basically means every day has its own troubles. Don't add to the troubles of one day.
All right. And even the way he phrases the rest of that, and I'm going to get into trouble for saying this, but here we go. It's good for you to remain as you are, remain unmarried. Are you married? Do not seek a divorce. Are you unmarried? Do not look for a wife. But if you do marry, you have not sinned. And if a virgin marries, she has not sinned.
I'd speak up because I'm not sure that.
Oh, okay.
You're being very soft.
I'm reading too. I see 2 faces out there that are looking back at me. Barbara and Betty, did you hear me as I was reading those texts? Or do I need to reread them? Okay, but I'll be more careful.
I can hardly hear you.
Okay, so and then he goes on to say the equivalent of what Patrice just mentioned from the King James Version. So here's something that, again, I think relates to the broader understanding, or how we have to understand a little more carefully what is being described here. Are you married? Do not seek a divorce. He doesn't say you're not allowed to divorce. Did you catch that? He says don't seek one. Remain the way you are. In other words, you may be living in a situation where I'll just leave it at that. I think the statement is fairly straightforward and clear. So he leaves open the possibility of divorce. He says it's not preferable, but he also says if you're unmarried, it's not preferable to be married because of the situation in which you live. Yes, as Patrice said, the situation in Corinth is very relevant to what goes on, obviously, to the letters to the Corinthians. The situation in Corinth is such that you do not want to use the example of Corinth as an example for how how you are living, or how your congregation should be developing. In Corinth, as Patrice said, Rav Shul had to deal with all kinds of difficulties. And in fact, they raised a number of questions, and when you go through the book of 1 Corinthians, we see repeatedly, now concerning, fill in the blank, now concerning, fill in the blank. There, Rav Shul is responding to direct questions that the Corinthians were asking him. In other cases, if you read carefully, he's chewing them out for their behavior. So all that is meant to remind us that when we look at 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians, be careful how you read it, because their behavior is not something that is intended to be emulated. Okay, now that brings us to the very first line and a half of the question. What kind of insight can rabbinic literature shed on Yeshua's halakhic decision with regards to the adulterous episode in the Gospels? Please cite the rabbinic sources used. Well, I will do what I can with that, but the adulterous episode is in John chapter 8. The opening paragraph or paragraphs. He says as he turns to John chapter 8. It's about the woman who was caught in adultery, and
Supposedly.
They are there's some teachers of the Torah and some Pharisees. The text says, brought in a woman caught in adultery, and they brought him to Yeshua. Now, one of the first things you need to understand, if you happen to be looking at an NIV study Bible, maybe I'm going to guess in all of their translations, not just the study Bible, it says the following: the earliest and most reliable manuscripts and other ancient witnesses do not have John 7:53 to 8:11. In other words, what they are saying, if you examine the earliest sources and the most reliable sources for the gospel documents, this is not part of the Gospel of John. I'll say it again, this is not part of the Gospel of John. And if you read verses 7:53, which is the last part of chapter 7, through 8:11, you will find that the style is different than John's style. Not only is this not found in the earliest and most reliable sources, this particular incident is sometimes found in the Gospel of Luke. It doesn't match his style either. So what are we dealing with here? We are dealing with a passage in John, and the reason it even shows up in the first place is because later less reliable sources were the first sources that the King James people had and the pre-King James people had for their gospel documents. So they took the documents as they had them, the copies as they had them in front of them, and translated those. Later, earlier and more reliable manuscripts were uncovered, and as they were uncovered, and I will say it again, they were earlier and more reliable than the ones that were used for the King James and the Bibles of that time. These earlier, more reliable sources indicated that this was not part of the Gospel of John. Was it part of the Gospel of Luke? Probably not, because it's found in only a few of the copies of Luke, and not in any of the more reliable ones there either. So this is not gospel. That, however, does not deal with the issue of, is this historical? Is this historical? The setting itself, if you read it carefully, gives you the impression that it is in fact historical, because it reflects the kinds of interactions that Yeshua had with some of the religious leadership and the way in which Yeshua responded to various kinds of situations. And that would explain why this found its way into John in the first place, or into Luke, because somebody, as they were copying texts, was aware of this particular section and felt that it needed to be included because it was considered reliable historical material.
It was a real story.
It was a real story, yeah.
Something that actually happened.
So, there is, however, yet another problem with this particular text. And I'm trying to see where it is. Okay, yes. If you read John 8, verse 6, it says, they were using this question as a trap in order to have a basis for accusing him. But Yeshua went down and started to write on the ground with his finger. Okay, those first two lines that I read, the first part of verse 6, in some manuscripts of this particular inclusion, it's not there. I will say it again. In some manuscripts, this part of the section is not there. In other words, they were using this question as a trap in order to have a basis for accusing him, is a later addition to even this story itself. Are you with me thus far? If you remove that, then the whole section through verse 11 has a more authentic ring to that, because then you find the teachers of the Torah and the Pharisees doing exactly what they would normally do when they encountered a rabbi of note. Not only a rabbi of note and great repute, but also one who had a popular following. And in fact, what they're basically asking is, we know what the law of Moses says, but what do you say? How do we treat this particular woman? There is an awful lot that's in this particular text. I'm going to limit my comments on it because I will deal with it far more fully in commercial, the upcoming course, Jewish Roots and Foundations of Scripture,
Just
Part
in
2.
time for this just very course that you're going to teach next week.
Exactly. So feel free to join me in that. I will unwrap the various parts of it. In effect, to summarize what's going on here is, in all likelihood, if these were people, and it seems like they were given the way in which they approach it, were coming from the school of Hillel. School of Hillel taught that you, in situations such as this, and in situations where it was, one of the options was condemning a person to death, the school of Hillel would inevitably find a way not to do that. There is a statement in the Talmud, and I will cite it when I go over this, but I can't remember where it is right now, so I can't cite the source as the question asked, but there is a statement in the Talmud that says a Sanhedrin that enacts a death sentence once in 40 years is considered a court of, what do they call it?
Too harsh.
Too
harsh.
It's the equivalent of too harsh. I'll give you the exact wording when I get to it in the course. There is another version of that same saying in the Talmud, that if it does so once in 70 years, it has exceeded its authority.
One death sentence in 70 years. It's still too harsh of a court.
Yes.
I can think of millions of people who need to hear this.
Yes, exactly. So that appears to be the place from which this group of Pharisees and teachers of the Torah are coming from, and they're looking for some way to not stone the woman. And Yeshua gives them a way to do that. It wasn't exactly what they were expecting. I mean, the answer itself may not have been what they were expecting, but they were looking for a way to be able to free the woman, and so they thought that if they came to this reputable and popular rabbi who would enable them to find a reason to do that, then they would have a reason to do exactly that.
To stone her?
No, to
let her off.
To let her off. I'm tempted to get in more detail, but I'm not going to.
No.
I will just say the following. When Yeshua gives his response, whoever is without sin, let them cast the first stone, the people who brought this woman before him had their reason then for allowing her to go. And so they all left, and the text says the elder left first and then the younger. And boy, all kinds of interesting things are said about that. Let me remind you that in Jewish society at that time, the elders were respected, so what's going to happen? The elders are the ones who are going to be the ones who are going to, I know that's redundant, will be those who will be the ones who go first, because the younger will let them go. So even in the way in which this passage is structured, it indicates that understanding of Jewish tradition, not only in that time, but later as well. And also you could say in all likelihood, as is often the case, the elder would have a better understanding and a clearer grasp of what the Jew had just said and implied than would the younger. It would have taken the younger a little longer to come to the understanding. That would be another way in which you could read this. But the bottom line is Yeshua says then to the woman, where are those? Where are they? Has no one condemned you? That's very striking. They left without condemning her, because Yeshua gave them a reason not to condemn her. Too often the Pharisees and teachers of the Torah are viewed by interpreters of the text, it's not in the text, as those who are looking for a reason to condemn people. And so the Pharisees get bad press. We'll again deal with that upcoming. But none of them condemn her, and so Yeshua says, neither do I condemn you. Go now and sin no longer. So again, Yeshua is taking the lenient approach, which is in accord with the teaching of the school of Hillel, and in fact, given the response of the people here, this is what they were looking to do, is to find a reason to let the woman go.
But that's only clear when you don't have the second part of verse 5.
Or the first part of verse 6, wherever that occurs.
Oh, sorry, 6.
Yeah, that's right. Once you throw those two, that sentence in verse 6, it completely
changes the meaning of the whole story.
It completely twists the story around. Okay, fair enough. Does that answer the question sufficiently? Everybody else? All right, any question? Oh, gosh, it's that late already.
I kept talking.
Okay. Any questions from those who have joined us and who are with us in real time? All right, no questions on this? Then, yeah, that got longer than I thought it was going to be. Sorry.
Because you know too much.
Well, but look, it's a complex question.
It is a complex question, and
both parts are actually.
Both parts are, because it's such a hot topic in 21st century America.
Yeah.
Divorce is a hot topic. It's a current topic. It's going on all around us and affecting our families. If you would have talked about 100 years ago, not such a hot topic, and everyone's talking about it. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's also very important that and misunderstanding in no way adequately covers the issue. That the misunderstanding about the Pharisees and Yeshua's relationship to the Pharisees does not continue. It's very important that gets addressed. Mm-hmm. So, hence the reason for spending a little more time in the passage from John chapter 8. Now, I'm not quite sure which of the next two to deal with. We did get a follow-up to a question that we dealt with, I think the last time or the time before last, on what's often called the rapture, and I'm concerned that if we get into that, that might take a little longer.
Yes, it will.
So then
because you can't explain it quickly and quietly.
Yeah.
Nobody, I'm not saying he can, I'm saying nobody can.
So with all due apologies to the person who sent us the question originally and then sent us the follow-up question, we will have to wait
I just want to say a general statement, not dealing with specific things. Part of the problem of why it takes so long and why people misunderstand the book of Daniel and the book of Revelation is because it's not a letter that tells people what to do. It's not prose. It's apocalyptic literature. Apocalyptic literature is literature that is way out of the norm. It's that way on purpose. It would pop up in ancient times when a culture was feeling threatened and they felt like they were about to be attacked or even destroyed. Then God would send a prophet who would give them these messages that were dealing with heavy kinds of imagery. So when you're reading these passages of apocalyptic literature, you have to tell yourself, if I put my finger on individual words, that's not what this is about to understand it. If I look up each individual word in a dictionary, that is really sort of going to take me away from what this passage is telling me. You can't understand it using those methods that you would use of what does Rav Shaul say, or what do these history books say in the Torah. It's really important to see this not as something that you can put your finger on, but as it has a purpose. And probably if you took me in prophecy, we would talk about apocalyptic literature. But I find that every time somebody says, what does this word mean? In that passage, guess what? Probably it doesn't matter. That's not why he's writing this. He or she is writing this. Is that fair enough?
That's fair enough.
Please, that's always the prior question. What am I looking at? What type of literature am I looking at here? Is it a letter? Is it a history? Is it apocalyptic? Because they all have different ways of looking at them. Just like you would in English literature. Sorry.
And along that same line, please be aware of the fact that much of what's found in the prophets is in fact poetic literature. And you've got to understand that poetic literature functions different than narrative literature or than didactic literature. Literature that tells stories or literature that is meant to be straightforward teaching. And so you've got to employ that context, perspective, or outlook to the text of Scripture that you have in front of you.
I would like to say, too, you can't, well, you can, but you'll be way off track. You can't use logic in these passages. Really, you can't use logic when you're looking at poetry too much either. No. But let's just stick to apocalyptic literature. In today's American 21st century, we love to use logic, and lawyers on TV love to use logic, and scientists on TV love to use logic. And it's very great in science and in law. Two good examples. But when analyzing literature, it's not helpful. In fact, it can create roadblocks in the way. So, I'm just going to dump that here, and we can move on. Now, what are you looking at?
What you just said reminded me of another piece of poetic material, Song of Songs or Song of Solomon.
Song of Songs.
You do not want to take the descriptions that these two people who are in love with one another, you don't want to take them, the descriptions that they have of each other, literally. If I remember right, I was trying to find the text quickly here. The male counterpart talks about his female counterpart having a neck like a tower.
In this culture, not a compliment.
That's exactly what I was going to say. If I told any one of you, whether you are female or male, you have a neck like a tower.
Well, that doesn't make any sense. That's not logical.
Well, I wasn't even going to say logical. That's not very attractive either.
No, it isn't. No.
Yeah. And yet, it was attractive in this particular context, and that's what you need to keep in mind. If you are interested in doing more reading, and we will get to this the response of the person who asked the question on the rapture. As I was reflecting on it this afternoon, I was reminded of a book called Three Views on the Rapture.
Oh, you got it in your library there.
Yes. If you want to read more about it from people who've spent a lot of time studying it and who've looked at a number of the details related to it, and this goes to the person who asked the question and then responded with the follow-up question, you will find a lot more detail and a lot more information than we will be able to ever give you during one of these question and answer sessions. Given the nature of the courses that Patrice and I teach, we don't have enough time in those courses to go into great detail in it. So the book is Three Views on the Rapture. I believe it's published by Zondervan, and I can't remember who the editor is, but I was reminded of it because one of the contributors is a former professor of ours. His name is Gleason Archer. So if it includes his view, then that's the book that you want. Three Views on the Rapture. Just a quick word about Archer. He had degrees, as I recall, in Semitics, which means not just Hebrew, but other Semitic languages, Greek. He also earned a law degree. He went to both Harvard and Princeton. I'm trying to remember if he also went to
He couldn't get along with anybody. No, I'm kidding.
He knew 22 languages fluently. Most of them were the ancient languages. So Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek were certainly among those. So this is the nature of the person who's one of the contributors in that particular book, Three Views on the Rapture.
And I had Dr. Archer for the book of Job. That was the only book in the course was the book of Job. And I remember taking my Bible to class, and he was the only professor that when Dr. Archer said, this sentence in the book of Job is wrong, it's wrongly translated, it should be this, I would actually take my pen and write it in the margins. So.
All right, now you're asking us, how did Gleason Archer come up in our discussion? Well, one, because he's part of those contributors to the book on the Rapture, and two, because he did, as Patrice just mentioned, teach her the book of Job. And the final question we're going to deal with, I think, in our session today is this question: are the sons of God in Genesis 6:2 the same Hebrew word that we find in Job 1:6? So that's how the Job connection was made.
And we are totally failing unless you want me to go in the library and get a Hebrew scriptures, because she's asking, is this term the same as this term? Should I absent myself and go find one?
No, I think it's going to be the same because it's the term sons of God.
All right, and this version has angels.
Yes, because she goes on to say, and who do you believe this is referring to? The New King James Version commentary says that they are
fallen angels, and what I'm reading from is the New International. I'd feel better if I actually looked them up.
Well, free to.
Oh,
the rest of the question says the Chumash commentary says they were probably sons of rulers.
And that is what, and the short answer is, that's what I would say is also correct, even though I haven't read the Chumash.
Okay. Well, the question
Yes.
is it the same in Job 1?
I know, and that's why I was going to try to.
Yeah. No, I meant would you interpret the same? I'm going to guess it's B'nai Elohim, but go ahead.
There are, okay, if I can remember, this is from a different professor of ours that we still greatly admire, who's still with us, Dr. Kaiser. And in our class on the Torah, so the first 5 books of Moses, he went over this part of Genesis very distinctly. He said that in Genesis you have a controversy because of the way it can be translated. Remember, translation is not 100% yes or no, in or out. Translation is the choice of the translator, what that person thinks is the best way to understand it. And so, hang on. 6. There are 3 ways to interpret what's going on in Genesis 6, starting in verse 1. When people began to increase in number on the earth, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God, there's that term, the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. Verse 3, then the Lord said, my spirit will not contend with people forever, for people are mortal. Their days will be 120 years. The Nephilim, here's what we're talking about. The Nephilim were on earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of men and had children by them. They were the heroes of old, men of renown. Men of renown. So is this angels visiting the earth and having sex with humans and creating a race of people that were still there during Genesis? Or is this some kind of person that's being called the sons of God, and they're very mighty, and these people can just grab whatever single woman they see and get married to them and have grand and great human babies? I think, I can't remember the third inkling of that, but I think it's pretty clear. And some people will argue for this whole idea that angels came to humans and they had sex and they created this new brand of people, and they were giants, literal giants. They were 7 feet tall. Once again, giants. It means, in Hebrew, it's great. They were great. Doesn't mean they were 7 feet tall. But this group of people became known as the Nephilim. And my understanding is basically rulers, great and mighty kings, came down to the common people to choose wives for themselves. So you had very high up, privileged and powerful guys coming down and taking women from among, the hoi polloi. God was not pleased with this, because he says, my spirit will not contend with human beings forever, because he's going to die. And then all of a sudden this term Nephilim, when the sons of God went to the daughters of men and had children by them, there is no evidence. There's no evidence that angels had sex with humans and created this race. Sorry. I know that Mormons are big on the Nephilim, and it's involved with their particular story through Joseph Smith. But once again, I wouldn't rely on Mormons to be sort of accurately in translating and understanding what the situation is. So it's humans. Both sides are human. But the problem is a sociological problem, which is rich, powerful men are just coming down and taking whatever women they want that, among the riffraff. And then they're creating their own private little group over here. They were the heroes of old. Yeah, because they were privileged, and even their children would be privileged and important. And that also does not mean that anytime you see the word giant in the rest of the Tanakh, that it automatically means the Nephilim. And that's another way too far out there assumption that some people make, and then they try to get logic out of that. Remember what I said about logic? Not exactly helpful. Not exactly helpful. And what have you found out?
Well, basically what you were saying, there is another possibility, unless I missed when you said
Okay, yeah, if you got yeah.
there is another possibility in that the sons of God were from the more godly line of Seth, and the daughters of men were from the descendants of Cain. And so it may refer to a disparity between those who had a relationship with God and those who were far from God. That's another possibility for what's going on in Genesis chapter 6.
Okay, I'm going to get the Hebrew scripture
Oh.
so I can look it up. You continue talking.
Well, there's not a whole lot more that I have to say on this, but you need to hear it. So, in
I can hear you.
okay, in Genesis 6, as Patrice says, the strong likelihood is what you're dealing with is one of two possible kinds of encounter. Those who were rulers or people of renown marrying those who were not. If in that whole paragraph 6:1-3, it's hard to know exactly what God is displeased with. Later on in verse 5, we're told what specifically is displeasing to God. So in the interrelationship between sons of God and daughters of men, now as it's described here in this particular text, we're not sure what the problem is. If this is in fact a marriage between the line of Seth and the line of Cain, and therefore, how should I put it, disrupts the one line from following God fully, that may be what's displeased. If this is a reference to people who were men of power or reputation marrying women who were not, and the phrase in is they married any of them they chose, it's possible that they were forcing themselves on these people, then that could be what is displeasing. But ultimately, what disturbs God in Romans, in Genesis chapter 6 is this, verse 5, the Lord saw how great man's wickedness on the earth had become, and that every inclination of the thoughts of his heart, and I've read it as man and his, this is just, the text literally means both men and women, and every inclination of the thoughts of their heart was only evil at all time. That's the thing that God was concerned about. We're not quite sure how this intermarriage that's reflected on the opening verses applies. My inclination is when you get to Job and you look at the phrase in Job. Before we get to there, the questioner also said the Chumash commentary says they were probably sons of rulers. Chumash commentary. The Chumash is the commentary on the Torah reading of the week. And the larger text that includes the Torah readings for the year and comments on them is called the Chumash. So Chumash and commentary are almost interchangeable terms. It is striking that they opt for sons of rulers as well. That reflects on the long-standing Jewish tradition as to what's going on in Genesis chapter 6.
Yeah, this is the stone Tanakh, the art scroll, and it says, the sons of the rulers saw that the daughters of man were good, and they took themselves wives from whoever they chose.
Does it have a note on the bottom on sons of rulers?
Yes, these were the sons of princes and judges, for Elohim always implies rulership, says Rashi. Daughters of man refers to the general populace.
Okay.
That's what this is.
All right, now, if you will look up
The Job?
the Job 1:6 text,
Yes, Job.
because I'd be interested in finding there. Because as I looked at it this afternoon, I just looked at it again. The opening chapter of Job, to me indicates that the term that's used there, that is the Hebrew sons of God, is a descriptor of angels, and in fact builds on the concept that there is some sort of a heavenly council that is part of the court of God.
Job 1:6.
Yeah, that is part of the court of God, and that seems to be what's taking place there.
Yeah, here in Job, this Tanakh says, it happened one day, the angels came to stand before Hashem, and the Satan is what it says. Two came among them. Hang on for a second. It only talks about Satan, which means the adversary, so that's not helpful as far as what our question is. But let me see if I can find the actual phrase in here. You can talk.
No, I'm
Both
trying
of
to
us.
find it also. So anyhow, what I was saying is it seems to be a reference to angels, and if you use the broader sense of sons of rulers who are rulers themselves, you could certainly apply that kind of a broad general designation or description to angels who are functioning in the heavenly court. And so in that case, it describes their role in the heavenly council with this term that could be similarly applied to humans in their role as part of whatever leadership circle or rulership circle there was that was being described.
Okay, I've got it in Job. It says, B'nai ha-Elohim.
So that's the same then as it was in Genesis.
Let me double check the Genesis.
6:2.
No. Ah. This 2. B'nai ha-Elohim. It is the same
Yeah.
phrase.
Which is what I had suspected, but again, if you're using the broader term as the Chumash in its commentary point out, that these are the sons or descendants of rulers, therefore they are rulers themselves, that phrase can be used to apply to both humans and to angels who are part of the heavenly court. Does that make sense?
Yes.
I mean,
But-
the same Hebrew phrase can be used, but it doesn't mean...
Yes, correct.
So in the one case, it means humans. In the other case, it means angels. But in both cases, it means people who are part
So
of...
far above us, we can hardly attain their rank. But it also
A
is
royal court,
it's
yeah.
not malachim, which is your normal
That's
word
right.
for angels.
That's right.
Malachim, which the root of that is king. So a king is a melech. This is a malach, same 3-letter root, which means it has the same semantic origins. And malachim is your normal word for angels, but once again linked with God. And this is another name, sons of
Yeah.
God.
So what I'm arguing, and as Patrice said, that's correct. What I'm arguing for is this phrase refers to people who are members of a very high royal court. Who are these people who are members of a very high royal court? Well, they could be humans. But since in the context of Job chapter 1, it's a heavenly court that's in view, they are the people who are the upper level hierarchy of angels.
It's a sociological problem.
Yeah.
Whenever you have, like, I'm trying to think of a very poor modern day example. If you have the Kardashian women and they go among, the poor people of Los Angeles looking for their husbands, it creates a rolling problem that just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. For the people who are just trying to live and have their own little life here to be sort of like run into, and then something is taken from it and now they're gone and they go with the upper class guys, it's going to create a problem for them. It creates a lot of unrest among the regular populace.
And given what Patrice just said, and building on what I tried to present to you as the use of the term, in Genesis 6 then, it would appear then to be people who were in positions of authority and power, taking people who were of lower positions than them, and in a sense pressuring or forcing them to become part of a relationship And they could do that because they had greater power. And they did so because in this particular case, the gals were very beautiful. And they married any of them as they chose. It seems to indicate then, to me, that phrase seems to indicate that it was a forced marriage because the women had no option to choose negatively.
And that paragraph has a negative spin
Yeah.
on it. This is not, oh goody, we'll look forward to more of this. No, this is not good because the surrounding information is not good. Verse 4, the Nephilim were on the earth in those days. They were the mighty who from of old were men of devastation. So Nephilim, probably humans, but men of devastation. That is not a positive thing about the Nephilim. They're very destructive. This whole section of Genesis is showing the need for Noah and the ark.
Yeah.
That's what this whole section functions as. It's not good news. It's not, oh, look how nice things are going with God and people. No, it's the opposite. So this would be something that you don't want to have happening rather than, oh, goody, we have angel men.
Yeah.
No.
And in the broader context of Genesis 6, I would opt for it not then referring to the line of Seth intermarrying the line of Cain, because although that could produce problems, it certainly would not produce the same kind of problems that if these were men of power who were forcing women who were of a lower status and therefore less power into a relationship with them. That is a far more egregious situation than the other. So
Okay, I have another question that arises from this talk about Cain. So when was the curse of Cain lifted? Or when was it no longer applicable to the descendants of Cain? By the time of Noah, it's gone. They're not cursed. Because all the sons of Noah are fine.
yeah, but they're not from Cain.
How do we know?
I think if you
If I did the genealogies.
if we did the genealogy,
I'm not
it
gonna
goes
do
back
the
to Seth.
genealogies.
So perhaps the curse from Cain is not lifted.
But it doesn't, we don't
But it
see
is.
it being played into anything.
Well, once the flood's in place, after the flood is done,
Then it's no more.
Then
That's
it-
what I tried
yeah.
to say. That's
Yeah.
They're
Yeah.
the end of it. Yeah, interesting. It's sort of like who did Cain marry if there were only 4 people on Earth?
yeah,
Sort of like that question.
yeah, and we're not going to answer that question, but
There were other people.
there were other people. For these kinds of questions, the ones that we've dealt with, and the ones that you will raise in future sessions, I did a little bit of research this.
Yes, you did. You're good.
Because of some things Patrice and I have talked about. We have already mentioned Gleason Archer and his credentials. A lot of the problems and a lot of questions that you might have can be found in
About the Tanakh. This is only about the Older Testament. This is not.
well,
They dabble in the New Testament, but it's primarily, this is
he's-
about the Old Testament.
yeah, but I'm talking about this one.
Oh, okay.
Archer has a standard, something called Survey of Old Testament Introduction. It deals with the various questions that arise relating to the authorship, the date, the purpose, the historicity of the various books of the Older Testament. It's only about that large a book, but there have been books that large.
R.K.
written on it.
Harrison's is.
Easily that size. And Archer does a wonderful job of that. Archer also has something called Encyclopedia of Biblical Difficulties. That's another good place to check if you've got questions about the texts or that arise from the Bible in some way, shape, or form. Another one of our mentors and also was a good friend of ours. Well, I guess Archer was too. Archer served on
Our board of directors.
one of our board of directors of the ministry we were part of. But Walter Kaiser, Archer is no longer with us. Walter Kaiser, I think at last count was.
Yeah, he's in Wisconsin.
Wisconsin, yes. here are some things he wrote that are directly related to the kinds of stuff we're dealing with. One is called Hard Sayings of the Bible. One is called Hard Sayings of the Old Testament. And if that wasn't enough, more hard sayings of the Old Testament.
He has his own website.
And then the last of the books that I jotted down, he's written more than this. Tough Questions About God and His Actions in the Old Testament. For one of you who are out there virtually with us at this point, you asked a question about Job last night. I'm going to guess that in one of these books you'll find a whole lot about Job.
Especially in Archer's books.
I'm going to guess that Kaiser will.
I'm sure I didn't take him for this particular section.
Yeah. So some resources to follow through on. Okay. I think we have more than.
We've beaten this dead horse enough.
We have. Yes.
There is no horse too dead to beat.
Yeah.
At least among theologians. I see that hand. I see a hand.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am. What you got?
You mentioned when we were on the divorce discussion, you talked about spousal abuse being. When was that? When did that come into as a possible way to get a divorce?
Okay. It is there in some rabbinic discussions. I can't cite them per se. I don't know that it goes back as far as Hillel and Shammai.
Okay.
I do know that I first heard some very good discussions of that. Obviously, I'm not from the time of Hillel and Shammai, so but I heard them very early on in Christian discussions as well of divorce and remarriage.
Okay. No, I mean I get it now. But
Oh, okay.
Because when you mentioned that, I thought it was being a little bit anachronistic because a wife was like chattel. So at what point does it become she's bad? If she is being treated badly, at what point? How do you
Gotcha.
differentiate between this is my property, you're being abused? So,
Okay, that raises a whole other issue, but
I have an answer, but I want to hear what you say.
Oh, okay. My response would be that, and I'm hoping that this got picked up on. Did Barbara and Betty? Did you hear what Jackie asked? Oh, good. Then it did get picked up. Then I don't need to repeat it. I would that way it's recorded. All right. Without having the time to develop it here, let me say bluntly, in Jewish circles and in history, women were never treated as chattel. Period, exclamation point. There are those who misunderstand not only the biblical text, but also Jewish texts and Jewish history and tradition, and they get that wrong. Let me give you just one quick example. There was a doctoral dissertation that turned into a book. Bernadette Bruton, one of the Ivy League schools, I think it may be Brown.
Women leaders in the ancient synagogue.
Exactly.
Yes, she wrote that.
Yeah.
That is a classic case that lays to rest this whole understanding of women as chattel or less than equal with men. And ultimately it goes back to women queens in Israel. It goes back to the time of Deborah, who was considered a judge over Israel even before we had rulers. So at least within Jewish tradition, and certainly well in place by the Second Temple period, but also the First Temple if you're dealing with Deborah, women qualified for leadership, so they were not treated as chattel.
I was going to say there are rules about not harming your own animals. Just talking about your own flocks and your own animals. As a matter of fact, you're supposed to take better care of them than than anything else. Even if you see a neighbor's animal in a ditch, you're supposed to pull that neighbor's animal out. Even on Shabbat, you have to
You're supposed to do
go
that.
and feed your animals before you do anything else. That is a part of work that's allowed on Shabbat. I never hear stories about work allowed on Shabbat, but there is work allowed on Shabbat because feeding animals is not a party. So, and I think that then shows you if God is saying you can't do this to those that you own, these animals, they're not even human. Obviously, you can't do it to a human in your family. I would think that would be very strong, even though we're not told don't beat up your wife, don't punish her. We're not told that, but we're told in the realm of animals, there's no way they can get it back at you. They're at your mercy. Well, if they're at your mercy, then you must take care of them, and I think that would apply double to wives and women in the family. Are we taken advantage of because we have skills that the other gender doesn't have? Oh yeah. Like, I can't make dinner, go make dinner. But if you burn the pot roast, I'm going to slap you around. Yeah, God doesn't say that's okay. I don't mean to make light of the problem, but it's key. It is key. The more, even in my lifetime, the more decades go by, the more it is uncovered how many women are abused physically by their spouse. It's really bad. And I realize there are some men who are physically abused by their wives, and I'm sad for that too. But it might be like 90% of the cases are the husbands are taking things out on the wives that shouldn't be done. And I would say that renders the marriage null and void. Just my opinion.
Adequate?
For now.
Well,
No, go ahead.
Well, I know that there are a lot of there are women with special abilities. I mean, in the Talmud we've got what's her name? Mrs. Meir. I've forgotten her
Yes,
first name.
Bruria.
Bruria, and Deborah, as you mentioned, and there, but it wasn't in the general population. That was not the case. Yes, women had specific tasks and they had control of certain things within the household, but they weren't in the general population. They weren't at the top of their game. Let me put it that way.
The women weren't at the top of their
Were
game.
not at the top of their game.
Well, that's been true in the 20th century too.
Yeah.
So I can't. That's still true. So
Okay.
that's all of history. It's been like that.
Yeah, and I would argue that in Jewish circles, that was not the case.
Jewish circles were way, way better
Yep.
than your average person on the street.
And a perfect case in point is Proverbs 31 and its usage. Proverbs 30 and its usage. First of all, Proverbs 30 as such, and then Proverbs 30 and its usage in Jewish tradition down through the years. And also the way in what women did and were responsible for in certainly because we got more detail in the Second Temple period. In the Second Temple period, it was an entirely different situation than it was through the Roman Empire or the preceding Greek Empire. So what you describe is certainly the case among the Greeks and the Romans and their empires, but it is one of the things where Judaism stood apart. Now, in all fairness, in the Middle Ages, and
That's different.
that's a different story.
Because everything, especially in the Dark Ages,
Yeah.
everything was different in the Dark Ages.
Mm-hmm.
I'm reminded of the Book of Judges. Every person did what was right in their own eyes in
Yep.
the Dark Ages.
Okay. Although the Dark Ages is a lousy place to leave things.
I'm just thankful we're not in them.
Okay.
I'm thankful they're in the past and don't apply to me anymore.
Yeah. Okay. In that case,
You want me to pray?
exactly.
Avinu Machinu, our Father and our King, we thank you and praise you that you have brought us to this evening. We thank you that you've sustained us, you've given us everything that we've needed, and now we pray for the upcoming week. Give us strength, give us courage, give us willingness to follow you, and help us to continually walk in your footsteps. Show us your ways, O God, and help us to see that the end is going to be better than the beginning, and that following you is really the only pathway to walk on. Take care of our friends, family, loved ones. B'Shem Yeshua Meshachenu, in the name of Yeshua, our Messiah. Amen.
And I apologize for an epilogue, but you're going to get it anyhow. It popped in my mind just as Patrice started to pray. It's an incident that took place one of our earlier study trips that we took people on to Israel. It took place in the synagogue. I was going to say Beit Shan, but that's not what it is. It's that we go into that is covered over and it has some
It's inside of a building.
inside a building. Do you
Beit
remember?
Alpha.
That's it, Beit Alpha. Alpha, Beta, how did I miss Beit Alpha?
It's outside of Tiberias.
Yes, and if you go in there, as we went in, it's an excellent place to go.
You see this giant mosaic of the floor
Yeah.
of the synagogue.
It's an early synagogue, and when we were there, I mentioned after the presentation was done and after our guide had said a couple of things, I added one thing. Said if you look around, you will find that in this synagogue, as in other synagogues, dating from the Second Temple period all the way through into the early Talmudic period, there is no separate seating for men and women. Men and women sit together, and this has been established archaeologically down through the years repeatedly.
That's what Bernadette Bruton is
Yeah,
discussing.
but she was discussing leaders. I was
Leaders talking about the building.
But I'm talking now. But
architecture.
there is, and when I discuss this, and I will discuss this as part of the class coming up as well, as archaeologists have pointed out, through the first several centuries of this era, there are no synagogues where there's separate seating for men and women. Men and women sat together. Well, I said that, and I noticed across the way somebody who was not part of our group, who was clearly an Orthodox woman by the way she was dressed. And I thought to myself as I was saying this, this should be interesting. And the Orthodox woman, boy, she tore into what I said, did not like what I said. But archaeologically speaking, that is the case. Men and women sat together going into the Talmudic period, if not beyond. There was no separate seating, and that is another indicator of how Judaism treated its women.
And that would include teenage children. I was thinking about the position of children. Small children probably would not have been brought to the synagogue because it was not seen as something you had to do. There's not a law about you must go to synagogue. There are other rulings about celebrating Shabbat, but they don't really have to do with required attendance. That comes from Christianity, this required attendance on your weekly holy day, whatever it is. But the teenagers, the minute they did their bar bat mitzvah at around ages 12 or 13, they would have been adults in the synagogue and would have been sitting presumably with their parents.
Yeah. All right, that was a longer epilogue than we had planned, but important.
You got more for your money.
Yeah, but important in view of the discussion
Free.
at the end of the session. So now you are officially excused. Those of you who've joined us virtually, and we see your faces or your names on the monitor, thank you for joining us.
Some of you we see on Tuesday.
And for those of you who've joined us here in person, thank you
Thank you.
as always. When will we next get joined together? It will not be in 2 weeks.
No, it's like next
Could-
month
Yes, because we're in New Orleans.
because we're busy and important.
Yeah, we'll be in New Orleans in
We have
2
to
weeks.
go away.
So, whatever the corresponding date to today is in February.
Let me look that up.
Oh, okay, you look it
I'm
up.
gonna look it up on my high-tech
I
calendar.
want to say it's about February 12th.
My high-tech calendar. Where I can see the whole month. I need to see the whole
Just
month.
say when in February.
I'm in January. Give me a minute. And it's a new calendar, so it's all sticky.
All stuck together.
So like the 16th, is that what you're
No,
saying? The
because it
9th?
turns out it's the 9th, because
It's the 9th.
February 1st is early.
A week after
Okay.
Groundhog Day.
All right, so we'll be doing it, we will next meet on February 9th.
Be here or be rectangular. Or ovoid.
Well, those in the monitor are definitely rectangular. Okay, enough said. We're going on long enough.
All right. Thank you for coming. See some of you Tuesday, whether you want to or not.